Okay, good morning everybody, welcome to the meeting. We are now quorate, so we will kick off just a touch behind schedule, but I'm sure we'll make time up. Item 1 is apologies for absence. I've received apologies from Assembly Member Berry, Assembly Member Cooper, for whom Assembly Member Arnold has kindly agreed to substitute. I think that's all of it. Are there any further apologies? Other than that, we are expecting everybody. Thank you, members. Item 2 is the declarations of interest. Obviously, members' interest as the normal way of recorded in the papers. Are there any others that anyone wants to declare at this time?
No.
Thank you. Item 3 is the minutes. Can we agree the minutes of the committee meetings held on the 11th and 12th of December 2018 and the 7th of January 2019 when we were examining the Mayor's budget?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 4 is the summary list of actions. Can we note the list of actions in the report?
Noted.
Item 5 is the action taken under delegated authority. Can we note the action taken under delegated authority, namely to agree the committee's budget response?
Noted.
Thank you. Item 6, the main item of business today, is London and Partners. Can I welcome our guests today? So Laura Citron, who many of us know, is the Chief Executive of LNP, and Andrew Cooke, who is the Managing Director of Operations and Governance. Welcome to both of you to the meeting. We're almost at the end of the first year of your 3-year business plan. Your strategy, not your business plan. How's it gone in the first year? What do you think the key impacts have been since the introduction of the new strategy?
Thank you. Yes, so we're 11 months into the first 12 months of the first year of this 3-year cycle, and I'm pleased to report that even though the external situation has been, for some of our work, challenging this year, overall we're performing well. So if we look at our GVA targets, we are on track to meet our GVA target for the year. Our target is 190 million, and year to date we are at 192, so I think we will come in the year just over target. If we look at our leisure tourism and study work, there we have engagement targets, which again, year to date, it looks as though we will meet. So I'm pleased to say that in this first year, when we've made significant changes to the organisation itself, including restructure, significant changes to the leadership team, new ways of working, new technology, opening new teams in markets, at the same time as making all of that internal change, we've still been able to achieve the targets for the year.
Okay. So you mentioned the reorganisation of the organisation. How complete is that now?
That is complete.
And it's all bedded in?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I can remember when you launched your strategy, you came in front of the committee and we were asking you lots of almost forecasting type questions, and one of them was around the decision to look at key markets and key sectors. How's that gone?
I think that's been really positive. So what we have done this year is add teams in new locations. So we now have teams in Paris, Berlin, Shenzhen, Bangalore, Chicago and Toronto that we didn't have in the past. And that was a key plank of the new strategy, which was to be closer to our audiences so that we could work harder at finding the businesses that might think about investing in London earlier and work harder to convince them. And that's really paid dividends. So I can tell you, for example, that this year, at the moment, the number of leads we have from Germany is 27. Last year we only had 13, and that team has only been up and running for a few months. In France it's 45 against 18. And then if I look at the offices outside the European Union, Chicago 58, Toronto 39, Shenzhen 26 and Bangalore 22. And these are all businesses that we have engaged with when they're thinking about an international expansion, so that we can work with them to convince them to come to London and to make a success of coming to London. And had we not had those teams in place on the ground, we wouldn't have been able to do that. So I think that's been really positive.
So what was the key thinking behind, thank you very much, the 5 core markets that you selected? What was the thinking behind that?
So the 5 markets, it's North America, China, India, France and Germany. And they reflect the largest markets for London and the balance across trade, investment, higher education and tourism. And they also reflect the biggest growth opportunities for the future.
Yeah.
So particularly China and India, we know, are our fastest growing tourist and student markets.
And the 7 sectors that you selected, what was the thinking behind those?
They reflect the sectors from the Mayor's Economic Development Strategy.
Okay, so it was a mayoral, trying to make it harmonious with mayoral strategy.
Yes, and those are the broad sectors that were picked out in the Mayor's Economic Development Strategy, and within those we actually focus on much narrower subsectors where London has real competitive advantage. So, for example, within the broad sector of financial and business services, we focus very much on financial technology, fintech, cybersecurity and cryptocurrencies, just to give you examples. Within the broad sector of creative industries, we focus on the areas where London has real competitive advantage, which are things like advertising technology, retail technology, and so on. So in practice, we're quite focused on the narrower subsectors.
When you're focusing on the sectors, is this are these sectors that you are proactively looking to generate leads and business in, or are these things that you are waiting for people to approach you on? If you understand the distinction between the two.
Absolutely. This is where we are proactively going out and finding new leads.
Yeah.
So this is where our teams will be doing research to look at which companies in our core markets in those subsectors have recently got investment or are looking for investment, as that's often a sign that they're coming up to think about an international expansion, and we will reach out proactively to those companies. We also, our teams in the markets would be attending sector-specific conferences and events to go and network and meet the companies there, and we would be constantly building out networks of people who could refer those businesses to us. So that might be venture capital companies or other kinds of investors who would know that a company was thinking about an international expansion, or it might be professional advisors, so lawyers, accountants and so on, who would often be the first people to know that a company is thinking about it. And by having deep networks in the markets with all of those players, our teams can get the heads up early, can be referred the leads, and we can then follow up. So it's absolutely proactive.
Okay, what about sectors outside the 7 core sectors? Would you turn away opportunities in those sectors? And if not, do you proactively look for any?
We would never turn away opportunities, either outside the core sectors or indeed outside the core markets. And we were clear about that in the strategy. So reactively or responsively, if businesses come to us or are referred to us, of course we will still service them and do our best to get them to land in London. But what we're doing with the new strategy is being much more focused in where we're putting our proactive resource, where we're going hunting, if you like.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, we're going to move on. Yes.
Just a comment before you move on. And it's about that point, because you can't underestimate, if you like, the sort of ripple effect of these teams. And I was just saying to Andrew before we started that I regularly receive delegations, and we've just had a request from a delegation from Vietnam, and one of the organisations, they asked us to see if they could meet, or somebody from them, was London and Partners. And so, you know, that whole having a team there and that sort of connectedness around a regions, I don't think you should underestimate that at all, and have the capacity to respond, because in fact that's how business goes, isn't it? Word of mouth or pattern. So I just wanted to feed that in, Chair.
Thank you. So moving on to the next section is around performance measurement and reporting, which obviously is key to your performance. Senator Deval's going to lead on that.
Thank you very much. Apologies for arriving late, and apologies for leaving early. In terms of performance measurement and reporting back, I mean, I think over the years there's been various attempts to improve on that. I recognise that. But I suppose the key question will be is how will London and Partners demonstrate its performance for 2018-19 with so few KPIs developed and a limited ability to compare those with previous performance? What's your thinking around that, and how would you demonstrate that to outsiders of your value and worth?
So perhaps it's worth just sharing with the with the committee. In the summary of the business plan that we shared with you, there's a table in the outcome section that might just be helpful to have as reference, which shows how the KPIs have developed over this period. So,
We have this in front of us.
overall,
I don't think they've got it.
You have spare copies, we haven't got them with us.
apologies, I thought you had this in your pack.
No, they're not in our packs.
No problem. I'll talk you through it and we can circulate it afterwards if
That'd be
that's
fine.
all right with you. So we're clear that metrics are hugely important so that we can be held accountable for our performance and the way that we're spending taxpayers' money, and also to incentivise and focus the behaviour of our teams. And as you know, our strategy has changed, so 2018-19 is the first year of that, and so it's right that the metrics have changed so that we can be held to account for the way that we're delivering that new strategy. The changes that we've made make the metrics more aligned with the strategy, more robust and more accurate. I fully recognise that there's more we need to do to make them more understandable so that that stakeholders can hold us to account for them, and we are doing work at the moment and will do before we publish our final business plan to make those metrics as comprehensible and as transparent as we can. And also to give confidence in the numbers, we are going to commission for the year 1920 onwards an independent audit of our outcomes. So getting an independent auditor to come into L&P and verify all the data and evidence that sits behind the GVA and the engagement and the perception calculations. So I hope that those measures together will give the committee, as well as the wider Assembly and our other stakeholders, confidence in the robustness and the credibility of our metrics.
So the metrics is wider than just the leisure or tourism outputs of London Partners. It's the entire shebang. Yeah.
Yes, so we have metrics across all of the work we do, and where we've introduced new areas of work, we are rightly introducing new metrics so that we can be held to account for those new areas of work as well. So we have metrics for our trade and investment work, our business tourism and our major events work, and our higher education work. For all of those, the metric is GVA. For leisure tourism, for pub, also for higher education, and for our work on London's global reputation, we have engagement and perception targets.
Okay, and part of the metrics is about your KPIs. You finally, you've settled within that. It sounds like you've settled all your KPIs throughout your organisation as well. Is that true, or is the metric slightly different?
The metrics are the same for the whole of L&P.
Yeah.
They're different for the different audiences. So the way that we measure our impact for trade and investment is different for the way we measure our impact for leisure tourism.
I get that, but so in contained within the metrics is a set of KPIs for all those sections of work that your organisation does.
Yes, if I understand
And
your
they're
question
final
correctly.
and they're correct. You've bottled them off, because the information that we had that you were still in the process of completing that process is finished.
We were. This was 2018-19 was the transition year. So
Okay.
some of them were already set for this year. Some of them we've set during the year. They are now set, and from 1920 they are fixed going forward. Yes.
And these are the KPIs, not targets.
So the KPIs being how we measure it, and the targets for 1920 will also be published in our business plan. Yes.
So all of your KPIs have targets?
All of our KPIs have a target against
Okay,
them.
so all 10, is that right?
I can confirm the exact number, but yes. Well, we have three types of KPI: GVA, engagement, and perception, and we measure them across the different audiences.
Yeah, measuring activity is not the same as setting a target. Obviously, the activity should get you to the target, but they all have targets.
They all have targets.
Okay.
Okay, let's turn to targets then, because some of your targets in recent years, you've easily outperformed those targets. So how stretching are your new targets from your point of view?
So,
And is that being independent validated as well, to say actually this is quite fair, these are stretching targets?
it's a good question, and it's quite difficult to set targets, particularly around the trade and investment work at this point, because the macro context is quite unknown. So our GVA target for our trade and investment work next year is the same as the target for this year. Now, depending on what the outcome of the Brexit deal is, that may be a very, very challenging target to meet, or it may not. It depends what happens. So that's why we've held it consistent with this year, but we're aware that we would have to review that depending on what happens. But I think that is a stretching target, and this year we have just made the target. So we had 190, and year to date with 2 weeks left of the year, we're at 192.
Yep.
And I have to say the teams have put in a heroic effort to get to that number this year. So yes, that has really stretched us, and we have had to seriously deploy resources very hard to meet that target. Yes.
And I suppose, can you just remind us within that, so in terms of how are you monitoring the performance of overseas officers? How do we know we're getting value for money and they're working in the right way?
So our overseas officers are part of the team with the London team, and a lot of the businesses they work with, they will be looked after both by someone in the market, and that's helpful because they know them, they can see them locally, they can speak to them in their language, but also by someone in London who's a specialist in the sector in which they work. So those are very much joint teams between London and the market. But to answer the specific question, from an inward investment point of view, we look at the number of leads that those officers are generating, and I've shared those with you. We're really pleased with, in the short space of time, how many new business leads those teams have gone and found. Those teams will also support inbound trade, so London-based companies that want to export or do business into those markets. So they will also be supporting those, and the achievement of that will be picked up through the GVA numbers for trade, which is through the Mayor's International Business Programme. So we can capture all of what they're doing.
Okay, a couple of tidying up points in terms of some of this bit then. It's really about the presentation, about how you present things. There doesn't appear to be any narrative or commentary against to support the published KPIs in terms of the raw data. Can you commit to actually producing some commentary on the performance against KPIs, so in future reporting issues, which would be helpful for us to have your commentary alongside it? And also, are there any plans to publish quarterly financial performance against budgets? Can we look at that as a scrutiny body? So we see how on your quarterly, on your financial performance, yeah?
So on the first point, absolutely, and as I said, I fully acknowledge that we've got more work to do to make our KPIs better communicated and easier for people to understand. So we will work on that. Very happy to add a narrative, and if committee members have other suggestions or feedback on how we can present this data better, then I would really genuinely welcome that. So please do let us know. I'll pass over to Andrew on the quarterly financial reporting.
I think it's a good point, and I think it's certainly something we can take back to our Audit and Finance Committee to discuss with them.
Okay, let's just go back to your quarterly 2 report, 218-19. Your quarterly performance report shows that proportion of resources that are not GLA grant is only 36%. This has been sort of contentious over the years of what it is. Is that figure go up and down then at different times? And so why is this in terms of that? Is that really what the proportion is? 60-40?
No, the target we have, and we have a target in that area, is to have a minimum of 50% of non-GLA funded resources. So it does vary during the year. Quite a large proportion of that 50% is value in kind, which we get from campaign activity. Earlier in the year, we haven't done a large amount of campaign activity. Since then, we've launched our London-Paris tourism campaign, which has generated quite a lot of value in kind. So at the current moment, we think we're close to that 50%. And we're aiming to achieve that this year, but again, it's going to be quite tight into the wire.
Okay, and that's the broad sort of overall figure. I presume on your various sections of work, then that some of that would be more important to see that ratio between public sector support versus what it levers in from the different sections you're working with. Would that information, can you break it down to that? So what I'm thinking, Well, the university sector spends a lot of money on overseas recruitment of students. We're spending lots of money. Well, actually, are they spending it separately for their university, or are they doing it for the sector? You're doing it for the sector. Isn't it time that we levered in some of that money from universities to do it for the sector, not just for their own university? So the London brand of that and higher education, does it work like that? Have I made it too simple? Have I got it wrong? And shouldn't I be seeing something around, not a target, but an effort to say, actually, come on, university sector, you're spending this money, we could spend it more wisely together on targeted campaigns that will be good for London universities and your own university. Discuss. I've only used that one. I can think of many other examples in your work, but should we not be then judging you about that, the ratio between our spend, their spend, and are we getting good bang for our bucks?
So just on that higher education piece,
Yeah.
we spend a very modest amount
I
of
know,
money on higher education, so it's about £250,000 a year. And what we're spending that on is, as you say, the London brand, and it's through our website, studylondon.ac.uk. So what we're doing is really engaging those potential students in terms of how great it is to study in London, and what the universities are doing are then clearly pushing their university as a great place to study. So we make referrals through our website to individual universities. We have in the past looked at marketing activity with subsets of London universities, mainly those that are not in the Russell Group, where they have come together with a consortium, have funded that, and we have then done marketing activity for them. Doesn't seem to be a demand from the universities for us to do that at the moment.
There was just examples, but can we not see a breakdown of that, even in small amounts of money? Because I think is making that money work hard for the task it's meant to do. I'd like just to see what those ratio is, and I may have chose the wrong example. There may well be better ones in tourism and leisure, of where we're putting in X, but what's the hospitality tourism industry putting in to maximise that take.
I think the way to do that, as it does vary during the year, is looking at that in our annual review, and it's something that we've committed to do in terms of providing more breakdown of spend in our annual review, and we can look at how we break down the non-GLA grant as part of that.
Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to hear that you've got the KPIs, they've all been done and sorted now. Could you send this committee a copy of your KPIs and possibly with some sort of narrative so that it can easily fit into what we're looking into? When you talk about the foreign offices, you said you read off a number of leads. This is something I've always been concerned about. On one of the many meetings we've had, it's a success if you attend meetings, I've been told. Does that go then into the matrix as a success if you attend a meeting? Is a lead literally attending a meeting or just meeting up with somebody, or is a lead something when you're literally putting people together?
So we have quite clear definition of what leads are, and we have different stages of our engagement with the company. I'm very happy to share that with you. In any case, we don't claim leads as an outcome metric at all. We know that it's necessary for us to generate leads, which is meeting companies who are interested in expanding internationally that we think we can convince to come to London, in order that they eventually convert, and that generates jobs and GVA for London and for Londoners. We only claim it at all if they actually do come to London and fill in a form that says that they have done that. So the leads are, for us, if you like, they're an internal metric that we use to be able to forecast how we think we're doing, and to be able to see how well our teams are doing at going out proactively, but they're not an outcome metric, and we wouldn't suggest that that's a robust metric for you to use to hold us to account.
Okay, you mentioned leads when you were talking about the foreign offices. How many successes have come from that are not leads but are actually something concrete?
So from the new international teams, there are a small number of conversions this year, but that's
How
normal.
many?
I can get back to you with the exact number, but we would expect that because the time it usually takes from meeting a company as a lead to them setting up in London is about 18 months. And we've actually seen that time get longer. So our average time from a lead to a conversion was 390 days last year, and it's gone up to 490 days this year. And that reflects the more competitive environment that we're in. Companies are taking more time to make decisions. We're having to work harder in that process to get them over the line. So we would expect to see the investment in the new officers coming through in the GVA numbers next year, but even more the year after that. It's a long-term investment.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Just a couple of tidy-ups in this section before we move on. For me, just on that subject, initially, it's very difficult when you've got things that convert and it takes more than 12 months, because I appreciate that that can skew figures one way or the other. But do you set internal, for your own management purposes, targets of conversions from leads to successes? And if so, how do you measure that?
So internally for our management purposes, we set lead targets looking at different sectors and different markets. Conversion targets are difficult because they depend on a lot of different things, but we certainly track conversion and we look carefully at if we've won, what do we think we did that helped us to win, and if we didn't and the business chose to go somewhere else, why did they do that?
If I were to ask you, what is your percentage of conversions from leads at the moment, and I appreciate there's different markets, different parts of the world, different sectors, on average, what is it?
I can tell you off the top of my head, but I'd like to write to you with the exact number if that's all right. It's about a third.
Perfectly fine, about a third, okay. I mean, that I think is one of the things that we will sweep up in the exchange of letters afterwards, because I think that's quite an interesting one. And if you can break it down by market and by sector, that would also be quite illuminating, I think. The other thing I was going to ask you, I'll come to Assembly Memorandum in a moment, is about how often your targets are reviewed. How often do you review? Do you review them in year? Do you publish different targets at different times?
So I think in a normal year, we wouldn't be reviewing a target in year. We would expect a target to be set at the start of the year. Next year, as I mentioned, we may want to go back and review targets depending on what the outcome around Brexit is. That may not prove necessary, but I think that might be an unusual year. And this year, as you know, we have set some targets during the course of the year because it was a transition year, but that's exceptional because it was this transitional year. So typically, no is the answer.
Because it goes to Assembly Member Duval's question about whether you're setting yourself stretching enough targets. And the one that I'm going to pick up on is the brand target. So the reach and engagement target. So in your Q2 performance report, there wasn't a target set, but the status was 2.95 million engagements across all business lines. At the end of Q3, so this is your Q3 review of targets, which came out last night, you're now sitting at 4.3 million. And the first time we've seen a target for this activity is in this report. And the target set is 2.5. Now that is lower than what you'd already achieved at the end of the second quarter. So that sort of plays into the narrative that the targets are not stretching enough. So, I mean, it's great that you've exceeded it, and 4.3 million sounds like a lot, but it's not a measure. Well, it's not a metric that means much if it's well within. You're not stretching yourself. Do you see where I'm going with that? I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Thank you. Yes, engagement, as you know, is a new target for us, a new metric for us this year, and we're trying to find benchmarks that we can use to forecast. Next year's targets are more stretching, but even sort of every day at the moment as we have live activity, we're getting new data and new information that will help us to set targets and to forecast. We have more stretching metrics in the 2019-20 targets, but I'm happy to look at them again and to write to you after this meeting.
Yeah, if you could. I mean, it's just to take that one example. It looks on this side of the table as though you had set yourself a target that you'd already achieved, and then you, in here, exceeded target, 173% of year-to-date target. The first time we've seen a target in any publishable document was in the Q3 report, when you knew you'd already exceeded it. And the point I think that's being made to you is that there is very little point in setting yourself targets if you already know you're going to do it.
Yeah, I understand.
Because it's not really demonstrating value for the money that's going into your organisation. So I think if you could pick that up in the exchange of letters, that would be quite useful. Thank you. All right, we're going to... Oh, sorry, I did say Assemblymember Arnold.
Yes, it's just I wanted to go back to a point that Assemblymember Deval raised. It was about education. Andrew, your answer was that it was a small amount that you sort of allocate to this area. And I just wanted to put that into context. Is that because we're surrounded by some really high-powered university that have a huge outreach program to, say, the Far East? I'm not sure whether they're recruiting in Germany, but certainly China, India, South America. So have you acknowledged therefore that you've got sort of bigger players in that field, and therefore this is the right amount? And if that's the case, then is it worth it? Because I'm just aware that some of these big players, they're talking about millions and huge teams. So if you're not putting in enough to compete, don't you always then have something in your business plan that you're not going to achieve very well on?
So you're absolutely right. Some London universities are huge global brands and have big international marketing teams, big international marketing budgets. Central St Martin's, the LSE, Imperial, UCL, KCL. But there are 45 universities in London, and many of them don't have the scale of international marketing capability of some of the big international players. And our work is very much, we work particularly with those universities, as Andrew was saying, outside of the Russell Group. And they really appreciate the support we give them because they have fewer international students, and that the international students are very important for those universities. So the large, well-known international universities in London are hugely important to London's global reputation and a real draw for businesses. You know, businesses come to us and they say, you know, we want to come to London because we want to set up an artificial intelligence research and development centre. Please introduce us to UCL and Imperial so we can talk to them. So there's a brokering that we do with universities on the inward investment side. But I think I wouldn't underestimate the importance of the work we do on the broader London offer for the wider set of London universities.
Okay, no, that makes sense to me. It was just, I was just a bit confused as to how small amount of money, how that was worthwhile, but
I think
that was a good answer.
I think it's also worth saying that whilst it's a small amount, it's actually the most efficient part of our business in terms of the return on investment we get for that small amount. And actually, if we increase the amount, the returns would probably diminish. So we think it's the right amount to be putting in that activity.
No, thank you.
Okay, we're going to talk about gross value added methodology now, because this is obviously key to your performance. Assemblymember Desai is going to take us through that.
Thank you, Chair. So I want to ask you about how you do this calculation, which are largely based on survey results. So the usual question that people ask about surveys, how many people take part, what's the response rate, and also how representative are the results of the population as a whole?
So we only count GVA for companies that complete a survey. We don't use a sample methodology. So the GVA number that we claim is the sum of the GVA for every company that we have supported that has completed a survey to confirm that we have supported them.
So it's a specific,
It is a specific number, it's not a sample. There are businesses that perhaps we've supported during the year that for whatever reason haven't completed a survey. Those numbers are not, you don't see that in our GVA number.
Right, okay. You use variables in terms of doing the survey. So how often do you sort of revisit the variables?
So there are variables in the methodology and the calculation that's done that converts jobs to GVA, and those are revisited periodically. I think we should write to you with exactly which ones are reviewed at which intervals, because it's not the same for all of them.
Actually, I was going to ask you that question then, that there's a section on transparency after my set of questions, but would you be able to give us the information about well, about not just about what you just said, the details behind your calculations in writing in due course and on a regular basis?
Happy to. We also published in the autumn a full paper which set out the complete methodology, including all the changes that we had made from the previous methodology, which includes the ways in which we have updated some of those variables.
And
but I'm happy to circulate that paper again.
Right. And very specifically, something I was trying to work my head around, that you've got something called you review jobs in year 1, and then you look at jobs in year 3. I was just trying to look at the briefing we've been given. So how often do you visit the year 3 job estimates? And do you make retrospective changes to reported figures when the estimates differ significantly?
So we ask companies when they complete with us how many year 1 jobs they've created and how many year 3 jobs they expect to create. So we ask them for their forecast. We then also survey historically businesses that we have worked with to look at how many jobs they actually created. Because we know that entrepreneurs, of course, are optimistic characters usually, and sometimes what they predict will be their 3-year jobs won't be. And we know what the ratio is between what they typically tell us their 3-year jobs will be and what they actually are. And that's what we call an over-optimism bias. So we discount whatever they claim up front by the over-optimism bias. So we're accounting for the fact that all of the jobs they claim may not actually come to fruition. So that's accounted for in our methodology, and the process we use for doing that is explained in the methodology paper that we published in the autumn, and which I'll circulate after this meeting.
We have that already. It's in our briefing. Yeah.
And I mean, just looking at your methodology as a whole, do you think there's any room for improvements? I mean, is there any way that you can...
So I think the changes we've made make our methodology more robust and more accurate, and I believe it's now an industry-leading methodology, and in fact the Department for International Trade are now adopting elements of our methodology to improve theirs. So I think at the moment I'm confident that our methodology is solid. That said, there's always room to improve, and I would expect us to be reviewing the methodology in a few years' time to see how we can further improve it. Also, as technology improves and you get new data sources, sometimes that opens up new ways of evaluating.
Thank you.
Just a tidy-up question. You said right at the beginning you calculate GVA on companies who complete the survey, which seems reasonable. Do you keep data on the number of companies you are liaising with at any point in time and then compare that to the number of companies who do complete the survey?
We should be able to get that. Let me write to you.
Okay.
Because we would know how many companies.
Because what I'm interested in is the average response rate.
Yes.
Because let's say, for example, you speak to 100 companies, 20 of them respond to the survey and 18 of those respond favourably, then you would say your strike rate is very, very good, and you would focus on those 18, but 82 maybe didn't. And that could change your figures quite considerably. So I'm interested in why people would complete the survey and how many are choosing to do so after interaction with you and how many aren't.
So I think it's slightly misleading that we're calling it a survey. It is a survey in the sense that it's a questionnaire. What we call it is a completion form. So it's not a survey that we send out to everybody at the same time. What happens is that our teams work with a company for 1, 2, 3 years. When they've finished their expansion into London and they've set up their legal entity and they've employed their first person, we then say, you have now set up in London, thank you, congratulations, please could you now complete this form to confirm what you've done with your 3-year job numbers, the impact we've had on you and any feedback. And they then send that back to us. Our teams work very hard to get as many as possible of the businesses that we have helped to set up in London to complete, to do a completion form, because it goes into our GVA numbers, and as you can see, we have to work really hard to achieve that. So that's high. So it's not a survey with a response rate in that sense.
Well, yes, indeed, but there's no obligation for anybody to fill out your form.
Absolutely.
And in order to understand and get behind the GVA number, it is useful from a scrutineer point of view to understand how many people actually respond, how many people do it, which is why I asked you the question about how many, on average, how many people fill it out. Because your GVA numbers are entirely dependent on people filling out that form, aren't they? Perhaps if you could cover that when you write us then, that would be quite useful. I think that would be quite illuminating if we could get that. Assembly-member Pigeon.
I can't remember the gentleman's name, but there's a guy who was appointed by the mayor to do sort of data and technology.
Theo Blackwell.
Yes, Theo. What work have you done with Theo and his team to look at how you're using data and what other data might be available and to improve your methodology?
So we work with Theo and the Chief Digital Officer's team quite closely. Chief Digital Officer.
Thank you. I couldn't think. Chief
So
Digital.
we work with the Chief Digital Officer closely. I'll admit, not on our measurement where we work with GLA Economics. Actually, they are scrutinising and have given a lot of robust feedback on our methodology to help us to improve it. We actually work with Chief Digital Officer closely on inward investment and trade because he has a really important role as an advocate and a spokesperson for London, because he's pioneering the use of innovative technologies in London, and also in terms of how London can be open and easy to access for urban technology, clean tech, gov tech companies, so companies that work in and around the public sector in London. So we work closely and he's very supportive of our work.
But he presumably has some role looking at data and things as well and using data. Have you had any conversations, or would you consider having conversations to see what he could bring that might add value to what you're doing?
It's a great idea. We will. Thank you.
Assembly-member Hall.
Wouldn't it be a better idea to get somebody completely independent and give them all the names of the company that you've worked with and get them to write to these companies? Because then they might be more likely to respond back favourably or not. We'd know exactly how many people that you are interacting with or not, and there would be a completely independent set of figures coming back. That would be far better to rely on if it's a completely independent look at how well you are or are not doing.
So we are planning to conduct an independent audit of our results, inviting an independent auditor to come in and look at all of the evidence that it makes up the GVA number.
Yes, I've read that somewhere, but wouldn't it be better if an independent company did that in the first place, sent out some sort of questionnaire or whatever else to these companies?
We can look at that. I think our experience would suggest that companies share this information on the basis of trust and the relationship they have with the individual account manager who has worked with them and held their hand as they've taken this leap of faith to expand into London, and that a lot of the reason that we can get them to share this quite sensitive information with us is because we have an existing relationship with them, and they trust that we are acting in their interest to support them to be successful in London. We could look at having that conducted by an independent body, but I would be concerned that we would lose very significant numbers of respondents if we did that.
That has happened in the past, actually. So I previously worked at Think London, where the London Development Agency did conduct surveys. We used the methodology which we've just described, but then periodically the LDA would carry out surveys of historic performance. The main issue there is changes in personnel within the company. So the person who made the decision was no longer at the company, couldn't verify the decision. So that's where you then get a drop in terms of lower results. But it is a valid methodology. We think ours is probably the most robust because we're asking the companies at the time when they're making their decisions, and it's the methodology that most other agencies use as well.
I've said before that doesn't always make it right. It's sometimes good to get independent views, in my view.
Okay. I'm sort of going to expand on this theme really and talk about transparency now. Assemblyman Pigeon is going on there.
Lovely, thank you. Transparency is something we talk about right across our committees here at City Hall, and it's something that we often have been concerned about, particularly with agencies that work with the GLA and the Mayor. Now, you have recently been consulting on your transparency policy. Do you want to update us on who you went out to consult with, the response rate you had, and any emerging results from that, please?
Yes, very happy to. So, as you say, we have, with our board, decided to develop a transparency policy and to consult on that. So it's a public consultation, and we also reached out to key stakeholders, including Assembly members, our partners, and some of our clients as well. We had 9 responses back to the consultation. I think 3 were from Assembly members, including yourself, Assembly member Hall, so thank you very much for that, and you, Assembly member Kitchen. We also had 3 responses from our partners, both some tourism partners and some of our business partners, and a couple of other responses, including TfL. So as a result of those responses, we have amended some of the recommendations within the policy, and from April onwards we are going to be publishing all expenditure over £250. We will publish a more comprehensive annual review, which will include a much more detailed breakdown of our expenditure against business lines, and it will also include the results of the independent audit we've just mentioned. We will publish details of all the companies that we have helped. Currently, the companies that we've helped on our trade and growth programs appear on our website, but we're publishing all the details of all the companies, including foreign direct investment companies, except where they have asked for their details to be kept confidential. We are also going to be adopting public procurement regulations, and will be publishing details of tenders on either Contracts Finder or the European Journal, the official journal of the European Union as appropriate. We will also be publishing details of senior staff with numbers of salary within salary brackets, and we will be publishing full minutes of our board meetings, the terms of reference of the London Partners Board and its committees, and also delegation of authority of decision making. And finally, we will make it much easier to find that information on our website, as we know it's not the most user-friendly journey to find that information currently.
There's a lot there, so I'm going to try and ask some further questions, and apologies if it's one I was trying to scribble down all the points you're making. So in the consultation document, it regularly talked about in the future we're going to do this, in the future we're going to do that. Is the timetable you said as of the 1st of April this will all be done? Or is it staggered throughout the year?
So the intention is to publish as much of the information as we can by 1st of April. We'll be adopting the public procurement regulations from the 1st of April. It's going to take a little longer for us to change our website and how that works, and so where that information will be found. It'll be on the website, but there's a broader programme in terms of how we refresh the design of the site.
Okay, so a lot of stuff from the 1st of April. Will you be able to then at some point look through the issues of the website and then give us a timescale for when you're planning, because obviously this is a new plan for you, you've got a strategy, when you're going to implement all of these considerable changes?
Yes.
That would be very helpful. Let me go through a few other things. You talked about you're going to publish full minutes of board meetings. Is this also going to be your committees and subcommittees?
The board has agreed to publish the minutes of board meetings currently.
So not your committees and subcommittees? No. Why not?
I think that the view is that in drawing up this policy, there were sort of 3 areas that we wanted to abide by, I suppose. So that is respecting the confidentiality of the commercial information relating to our clients and partners. Secondly was ensuring that any of the additional measures didn't cause an undue cost burden. And the third was to ensure that it didn't conflict with our corporate governance as a company limited by guarantee. And I think that the decision was this was the right balance in terms of striking, in terms of transparency, in terms of what was discussed at board meetings, where each of those committees actually report back to the main board so there would be information from the committees at the main board meeting, which will appear in the board minutes.
But surely, you know, Transport for London, we had to drag kicking and screaming to meet in public, and there's panels and subcommittees. In fact, I remember my former colleague Val Shawcross went and sat in one and was removed from the meeting until we got the legislation changed and they're treated like a local authority. Surely you could use that practice of how they operate. The commercial stuff, of course, isn't in the public domain, but we have a much more detailed idea of what's being discussed. Would that not be something that London and Partners could do to lead the way and show that you're being transparent in your work?
As I say, I think it's this balance in terms of us being transparent and our governance on the basis that we were set up as a company limited by guarantee.
Would you be able to set out for me in writing what it is and how you're set up that means you could not do what I'm proposing? What is it that absolutely prevents you from doing that?
We can certainly discuss that with the board.
Because you're saying how we've been set up kind of prevents us from doing that.
I said it prevents us. I said that's the decision of the board.
Okay, well, I don't understand how it conflicts with that setup.
Yeah, I think it would be quite useful to do exactly as Assemblyman Pigeon has just suggested and write to us and explain why. Because on the one hand, I have sympathy with your argument around being set up as a company limited by guarantee, with balancing that against more than 50% of your funding coming directly from the taxpayer. And I think that's perennially the tension. And from a scrutiny point of view, it's taken a very long time for London Partners to get to the point where we're even getting board stuff in the public domain. And of course, there is transparency, and then there is the appearance of transparency, and there's a tension between those two things as well. Sorry, Assemblyman Pigeon, I've
No, that's absolutely right. Obviously, you're going to all you've committed to is to publish your full minutes of board meetings. Will you also be making the meeting agendas and papers public?
That's not the intention currently.
So it's not remotely transparent, therefore, what you're putting forward. It's a tokenistic attempt to say, look at us, we publish board minutes, when actually the real detail, you know, I trawl over Transport for London papers, and that's where I often find out what's really going on, looking at those subcommittees, looking at that detail. Obviously, I don't know the price of contracts and the commercial stuff, that's in the confidential papers, but surely, as an agency that gets significant funding from the mayor and the public sector, you should be publishing everything so the public can see what you're doing. Do you not accept that? You're new chief exec, Laura, don't you accept that?
This is the most significant change to the corporate governance and transparency of London and Partners since it was founded in 2011. And we've made these changes because we recognise and we've heard your legitimate concerns as Assembly members about our transparency and our corporate governance. I hope that the changes that the board has agreed to do address at least some of those concerns. We can take your further suggestions back to the board for a further conversation, and I'm happy for us to do that.
Okay. Let's move on. There's lots more to cover. The consultation document says you're going to ensure transparency information is updated on the website every 6 months. Couldn't you do that just after every board meeting and committee meeting so that we can review things in real time?
So certainly board minutes will go up within a reasonable time frame after the board meeting. So we won't wait 6 months to do that, and our quarterly reports we will update quarterly. But in terms of reviewing the totality of information on there, we will do a thorough review over every 6 months. That's the intention of that.
Okay, and the correspondence handling policy and process, is that going to go as far as if you're covered by the Freedom of Information Act?
No, I don't think it will, because we're not covered by the Freedom of Information.
Will you review that so that you could act as though you were and provide that full information?
We can review that against the correspondence policy. I'm not familiar with what it is under for FOI.
Okay. Now, you did go through quite a lot of issues that I was trying to scribble down. the projects that you have directly supported, did you say that you're changing, will you be providing specific details outlining the benefits that your involvement has brought? Is that going to be information that will be available?
We won't be doing that for every project. We will be providing details of the individual companies we've supported, and we will continue to provide details of specific case studies on our website as well.
Okay, but you won't be doing that for every project you're involved with. You also mentioned earlier that you'll only name companies if a company says they don't want to be named as having had your help. You won't name them. Isn't that a bit odd? Why wouldn't an organisation, if they've worked with you, want to name that they've worked with you? Well,
the majority do, but there are some companies who prefer to keep their information confidential.
Find that rather odd. In terms of your contracts, can you just say what you're changing in terms of what you're publishing to do with contracts?
So we'll be following the public procurement regulations. So that means every contract that goes out to tender will be published on Contracts Finder, and those that are over the OJU threshold will be advertised through the official journal of the European Union.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so is there a barrier to publishing a register of all your contracts, not limited to just those over 150,000, and contracts themselves actually being out there in the public domain?
That's not something that we're proposing to do at the moment. We didn't get
Why not? In this era of transparency, you're consulting on it, you're keen to improve your reputation in this field. Why would you not do this? And this is something certainly the Budget and Performance Committees previously recommended.
So some of those contracts are commercially confidential.
Right, but you can redact some things in them.
I think it's important for us to remember that London and Partners was set up under the previous administration as a not-for-profit company, and that there are reasons that was done in order that we could be strategically aligned with the mayor, but operationally independent. And that's what gives us the ability to work in the ways that we do. I think the changes that we're proposing now, and which we've consulted on, are a very significant change and improvement in our transparency. I recognise that you would like us to go further, and we can take that back to the board. But I think this is a very strong set of changes that we're proposing now that it's very meaningful for us in terms of the transparency within our organisation.
You're coming from such a low base, and it may be a big step for you, but the reality is, I mean, you're years behind most other organisations that receive public money, and it doesn't feel like it's going far enough at all. Let's look at a couple of other things. Would you consider publishing your decision-making framework alongside your terms of reference for all your boards, subcommittees, and the delegation of authority?
Yes, the decision-making framework would be within that delegation of authority. Yes.
So that will be published?
Yes, it will.
From the 1st of April?
Yes.
Okay. And can you also give us more clarity around trade visits and delegations? I know you're involved in those, but what I'm not clear about is what's the outcome from those trade visits? Are you able to give us greater transparency around those as part of these changes?
So the outcomes of trade delegations and visits, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, first of all, can sometimes be quite long term, and second of all, often the outcome is not something that you could put a number on, but contributes to something much wider. So to give you an example, the mayor was in Paris in November and conducted a series of high-level meetings with both business leaders, state actors, political leaders. As a result of his interventions, which demonstrated how important London sees its relationship with Paris, he opened very senior relationships for us that our local team has then been able to follow up. We've been able to build long-term partnerships with organisations in France who over the long term, and already are, referring us inward investment leads, supporting London businesses when they go into France, for example. That's a really significant step change for us in our ability to work really well with our Parisian and wider French counterparts, which wouldn't have been possible without the officers of the mayor being in Paris and taking those meetings. Sometimes trade delegations will lead directly over months or years to specific deals. That absolutely can happen and does happen, though it takes a while for them to come through. But I think often the city-to-city relationships and the importance of the city-to-city relationships can't be underestimated, and the visits also play a really important role in building those.
Well, are you able to, though, say you do a trade visit with the mayor, with the deputy mayor, whatever, say the Paris one, are you able to publish, okay, this was the cost of the visit, these are the people who went, these are the sort of top-level meetings that we had, and then longer term, and it may well be you'd have to then look back and see what deals were made, what directly came from that, and what therefore the total sort of financial benefit to London was. But surely just that basic information early on you could publish, so we can understand what sort of thing, perhaps it's the tech sector you're really trying to work on, or the arts and culture sector, whatever, so that we can really understand what it is you're trying to get out of that.
We can put that narrative in our annual report.
Okay. You mentioned earlier in the list of things, Andrew, that you reeled off, that you're going to be publishing bandings of salaries. Can you tell me a bit more about that, please?
Yes, so the intention is to produce salary brackets of £10,000 and the numbers of staff within each of those brackets.
And when will that be? From the 1st of April? Fantastic. Okay. Good. And then finally, something the Assembly has asked for a long time is we clearly have issues with your transparency, how you work. We find it quite difficult to understand. I know you're trying to improve that, but we find it difficult to understand your methodologies and what goes on. Would you consider appointing an Assembly member to your board as an unpaid observer so we can really understand the work you're doing and what benefits you give to London?
So I think that's a question of governance, and the composition of our board is a question of governance, which is for the mayor and for the board. But the board did consider it in 2018, and they deemed that it wasn't appropriate, and that was really because by being involved in our decision making, it might compromise your important roles as scrutineers of London funds.
That won't do.
Okay. So that's the decision the board came to. How would you feel if the mayor's office did choose to appoint an Assembly member? Would you welcome that? Would you find that helpful? Obviously, that Assembly member couldn't then be scrutinising you. And we used to have this in the past. We used to have a member on the LDA. It didn't stop the Assembly doing our work, but it did give hopefully maybe some insight.
If that's the decision of the mayor and the board, we would welcome it.
Lovely, thank you.
In the context of that, I mean, the statutory deputy mayor is an Assembly member. The deputy mayor for fire is an Assembly member. The former deputy mayor for police and crime was an Assembly member. It is not in any way a bar on scrutiny for members of the Assembly to be members of the governance side of any of the mayoral agencies. It's got precedent all over the place. It's not a legitimate defence, I don't think, to say, well, of course, that would prevent you from being able to scrutinise this. It just doesn't stack up. And I say there are precedents all over the board. So, I mean, that's an answer we've heard many times from London and Partners in the past. It didn't really, we don't accept it then, we don't accept it now, I don't think. I've seen Assembly Members Hall and Assembly Member Arnold. Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. You keep saying that it was set up in this way to get to 50%. I've spoken to the people that set London and Partners up. The idea was that the public purse, taxpayers' money, would fund 50%, with the aim that London and Partners use their commercial opportunities to increase the private money coming in. It seems to be going in a different direction, because we've got around 63% being funded by taxpayers, which is why we are so concerned about transparency, because it's our job to make sure that taxpayers' money is spent correctly. We seem to be having the same disagreements time and time again with the constant comment, I'll go back and ask the board, and then of course it kicks it all into the long grass again. A couple of confirmations, if I can. On your consultation and transparency policy, one sentence, one question. We propose to publish an organisational chart for senior staff covering staff in the top 3 levels of organisation with the following information: grade, job title, department team, permanent or temporary, and minimum salaries of each level. Is that a typo? Or I mean, knowing the minimum, I'd rather know the maximum salary of a level.
So following the consultation, this was brought up as part of the consultation and a recommendation that we should publish salary brackets, and that's what we're now proposing to do, so that will be amended.
Okay, I'm very surprised that that was in there at all, because that tells you absolutely nothing, the minimum amount that somebody's getting. The recent consultation document also said that you'll conduct an independent audit. Who will the independent auditors be, and how will they be selected?
We will go out to tender and procure those auditors.
When are you going to do that?
We'll start that process soon.
Okay. And you're going to start the £250 publish expenditure of, when will that start?
So we'll start collecting the data from the 1st of April and then publish it quarterly.
Okay, good. Going back to something Assembly Member Pigeon brought up, I also find it very peculiar that people wouldn't want their information given out. So given that they've received free advice, free help, could it not be, and I have brought this up with you before, if people are prepared to take free help, free advice, well, it's not free, of course, taxpayers are paying for it, could that not be part of the deal? We will have to publish information about you, or perhaps you could switch it over to your commercial side and then charge them, because lots of companies in London do charge for the sort of service that you give. So why can't that be done? I've asked before.
So it is something that we do, and we have those conversations with clients when we sign them up to say that we would like to collect the information from you in terms of your investment at the end of the term, and we would like to publish details of the help we've given. Some, though, at the end say that they prefer to keep it confidential. It's a very small number, but we feel we need to.
But that's not good enough. If you tell them up front that's what you're going to do, that's unacceptable, isn't it? With respect, it's taxpayers' money. You are saying we will give you free help because it's free to them. It's not free to us. If you're giving that information in the beginning properly, then they have got no right to retain it. Yeah, is that not right?
So we will review how we communicate with new clients when we bring them on board to make it clear that that's our expectation. What we're proposing to publish is the list of all of the companies that we've supported. Take your point about it not being acceptable for them to say that they refuse to be in that list. We also ask them for a bunch of information that's very commercially sensitive about their jobs in year 1 and their 3-year job forecasts, and that they provide to us on the expectation that that is confidential and that won't be published. But I think you're right that there should be an expectation that the fact that they have received our free support is public.
Well, we've agreed that before, so I don't really know why we're even having that debate, because you've actually agreed that before. I just don't understand. If this was a company, a proper company, there'd be no question about this. You know, if you make a deal at the beginning, then you see that through. I'm also not always convinced that how many people work for you is something that they'd want to keep quiet, or why would they? If you've got a business, there could be very few businesses that would be ashamed to say that they've got an extra 100 members of staff.
Yeah, and those where they're very happy to do that, we publish case
No,
studies.
I can't think of any reason. Give me a couple of really good reasons as to why people wouldn't want people to know how many staff they've got working for them.
So how many staff they've got working for them today is a very important piece of competitive information. They may be trying to give the market perhaps the impression that they're larger than they are. They might not want the market to know where they've deployed their resources, so how many people they've got in London versus their other international locations, for example. In terms of their 3-year job forecast, that's highly sensitive because they are making a forecast about
On some of that, I can understand some of it, but I can't understand a lot of it. I think sometimes it feels like L&P is hiding behind a cloud of transparency that we feel we should be getting through, given the millions of pounds of taxpayers' money that is going to you to deal with. We feel we should be given far more transparency. I'll leave it at that.
Assembly Member Arnold.
There's a difference, surely, between working with an organisation and then being able to publish that organisation's name to the detailed business information of that organisation. Isn't there a difference? So I really don't understand the difficulty. And Shirley, if you like, your own brand is dependent on companies having trust in you. So how do you move from working in an open way with a company to a position where you would then dictate to that company that they give you detailed business information? Is that possible for you to dictate to a company that you're wanting to work with, that they give you that information? I don't understand how that would work.
So we can set out clearly when we start the relationship with them, when we first meet them. This is how we're going to work with you. These are the kinds of support that we can provide you, and in return, we will expect you to tell us once you have expanded in London these kinds of commercial information, which we will keep confidential, and also that you will tell us that you are happy for the fact that we've worked with you to become a matter of public record. And I think I'm hearing clearly from this committee that what we need to do is to go back and review very carefully how those conversations are happening to make sure we're setting out those expectations very clearly when we start the engagement with those clients. And that's something we can do.
Right. And then the other thing that I've heard is, and there's still a bit that I like clarity on, Andrew, you talked about the board making decisions. When the deputy mayor is there representing the mayor, the deputy mayor is party to this decision. So therefore, the deputy mayor was party to the decision that only so much of your information would be made transparent. Have I got that right?
Deputy Mayor acting as Chairman of London and Partners.
Right.
His role as Chairman of London and Partners.
So then you could then make a sort of like next step and say, if the deputy mayor, acting on behalf of the mayor, has made this decision, this is a mayoral decision to only go so far in terms of transparency with regard to London and Partners. Would that be a step too far?
Well, it's not necessarily the chairman's decision on his own. It's a decision by the board. So
Right.
it's a mayoral decision.
But a chairman come in, and as we've heard from a colleague, with 63% of the funding, that chairman is influencing the decisions that are being made by the board. Aren't they all? What's the point of them bringing their 63% to the business or the board if they're not influencing the actions taken by the board? You see, I'm just left with the feeling that if there was mayoral commitment to transparency, then there would be transparency. And what I can't understand is what's blocking it. Do you see what I mean? That's my problem, from what I've heard this morning.
So I think, yeah, the intention and the agreement with the board was to be as transparent as possible with how we're spending public funds. And then it was the three criteria that were set in terms of how far we would go in terms of transparency. So the respect of confidentiality for commercial information, the fact that there shouldn't be an undue cost burden, and there shouldn't be conflict with our corporate governance.
And it's right that the board makes this decision. I don't have a problem with that. That's not an officer decision. You're here to translate those decisions to us. But I go back to you and say that given that the Deputy Mayor is the chair of the board, it would seem to me that if a decision has been made in terms of transparency, then that has the full support of both the Deputy and the Mayor in terms of your structure, because you've got this unique structure.
I'd suggest that's perhaps a question best put to the Deputy Mayor's office.
Right. Yeah, you are so right. Thank you.
Okay. Right, I think we kicked that one around for a fair while. We're going to move on and talk about financing now, and Assemblymember Hall is leading on that.
Yes, thank you. So what are you going to do to increase your non-GLA income, and what split between GLA grant and other income are you aiming for in the longer term?
So the aim is to have more than 50% of non-GLA funding, and that's something that we have achieved over the last 2 years. So that comes from a variety of sources. So there are other public funds there. Currently there's £2 million of public funds. The majority are coming from European Regional Development Fund or our trade and growth programme, so the Mayor's International Business Programme and our Business Growth Programme. There's also funding from DCMS for the Discover England Fund, which is supporting us in developing bookable product for tourists in growth markets, particularly China. We're currently generating about £6.3 million from commercial income through a variety of sources. So we have partnership schemes which currently generate about 1.6 million. So those are commercial partnerships for companies that are supporting our foreign direct investment activity. And then we're just about to launch a revamped partnerships for our tourism members. We see this as a potential growth area in terms of the new scheme. We intend that we will be able to grow income over time from this new scheme, which we're launching in April. There's match funding, so this is funding that comes from partners for specific activities. So these might be companies that we take to trade shows to attract new congresses to the city, or sponsorship for particular events. We then have two commercial subsidiaries which generate income, so London Domains, selling those domains for London, and then London and Partners Ventures, which is predominantly tasked with generating advertising and e-commerce revenue from our digital channels. So those are the various income streams, and then we have this value in kind category as well, which we think is important to count because that in-kind support we get from partners really helps us to extend our reach. So that can be activity from partners for particular campaigns. So the London-Paris tourism campaign we're doing at the moment, which is to attract US millennials to come and visit London and Paris. There are partners there who are putting in-kind support, which helps extend that reach. So Marriott Hotels and United Airlines being examples of that.
Okay, I mean, it's one thing the GLA funding 50%, but because it's taxpayers that are funding all of these other things, like the European Regional Development Fund, Discover England, and then you've a grant of 0.4 million for the International Business Programme from the Mayor. I mean, all of this is still taxpayers' money.
Well, not all of it, as I
Well,
say.
you've got the
£6.3 million of purely commercial.
Is that purely commercial, or does that include Dot London Venture?
It does include Dot London.
It does. Well, that's 4 million, isn't it?
4.8.
Yeah, it's gone to 4.8. Was proceed assembly member pension. Yeah, so that's 4.8 of that 6.3. Is that right?
I've got 3.7, but yeah.
Well, nevertheless, it's one hell of a chunk, isn't it? And the Dot London thing was given to you, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't given to us.
It was applied for by the GLA, and you were allowed to.
We needed the approval of city authorities to run it, but it was our application.
At the end of the day, virtually your whole business is run through taxpayers' money, one way or another, or through getting the Dot London venture, etc. That's right, isn't it?
No, I don't agree with that.
What part of that don't you agree with? All the money from the GLA is taxpayers' money. The money from regional development funds is taxpayers' money. The Mayor's International Business Programme is taxpayers' money. I imagine Discover England is taxpayers' money. So, what part of what I've just said isn't right then?
Our partnership fees of 1.6 million, match funding of an additional £1 million, and the funds we get from our commercial subsidiaries of 3.7 million.
And that is from the Dot London.
Part of that is from.
Well, I've got 4 million of that, so one hell of a sum of that is from that.
Not on an annual basis. It's not
What's your total income per year?
26 million, including the value in kind.
26 million. And you're looking at that small amount that isn't taxpayers' money. And that's why we should get much better transparency. Okay, so if we go back more onto the finances, how are you going to look to get more commercial work in?
So we're looking at new opportunities through our ventures activity. We have a new strategy in terms of generating increased e-commerce activity. There is plans for us to support domestic tourism, which we will be doing on a commercial basis.
How much money are you putting into that?
We're not putting any money into it. It's going to be funded by the industry with some support by the GLA and from TfL.
Which is funded by taxpayers' money, again. Okay. Right. Because this isn't what London and Partners was set up to do with respect. It was set up to eventually stand on its own 2 feet and be... I mean, you're nodding, Laura, you know this. We have the same conversation every time we have a meeting. We have the same conversation that you're going to go back and look at things and talk to the board, but nothing changes. And in the meantime, we are looking at millions of pounds of taxpayers' money.
So we have moved from being 30% funded from non-GLA sources to 50% since London Partners was founded.
And if I can add, income generation is certainly for me a real priority going into 2019-20. We have relaunched our commercial partner scheme already last year with a view to being able to increase the revenue from that. As Andrew said, we are about to relaunch our tourism partner scheme with a view to making that more sustainable, better actually for our partners, but also more profitable for us, which is a new opportunity. We are using better technology to improve the revenue and the profitability of the e-commerce and the advertising on the Visit London sites, and we're also looking at new large-scale strategic partnerships with a small number of potential corporates who would work with us. So I think that this is an area that we are focused on going into 2019-20, and I would very much like to see us increasing the proportion of commercial income in future.
Okay, I'll leave that particular bit at this point. How much did the foreign offices cost you in both rent and staffing?
The total costs for all of our overseas offices are £2.9 million a year.
Okay, fine. Right, if we go on to the Brexit defence, how did you come to the decision to set aside 1.4 million for Brexit defence?
Is that the you're talking about the grant specifically?
Mm.
So as I said, our Brexit response runs through all of this 3-year strategy. So this 3-year strategy covers all of the period since the referendum, and so a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment is in the context of Brexit. So if I look at the whole 3-year strategy, I think there are 3 elements in particular that are responding to Brexit and helping us to portray a positive image of London around the world, but also to make sure that we can take advantage of the opportunities that will come to us from the high growth markets in the future. So our approach is very much to take as positive a view as possible. So the 3 things in the 3-year strategy are around London's global reputation, so continuing to tell the positive stories about London's enduring strengths, why London continues to be a fantastic place to do business, to study, to come on holidays. And we're doing that by building a network of influential business advocates through whom we can work and push out these positive messages. The second aspect was about being closer to our audiences, because we think a lot more of the business that will come to London, we will need to work harder, they will be asking questions about London. So as we discussed earlier, the need to have teams in market who can reach them earlier. So that's the second aspect. And the third, which was new for London and Partners, was to work with the existing international investor base. So in the past, we have always worked bringing new investors into London, but we haven't looked at the existing international investor base. And what we're doing is to really be working with existing investors to make sure that if their businesses are growing, that growth stays in London. So those are the three ways that we're responding over the whole period. So I would say that much of what we're doing is in fact responding to Brexit in different ways.
But surely point 1 is core business, telling everybody how wonderful London is, which it is, trying to persuade people to invest here. Surely that is your core business.
It is core business, but we're having to do it a lot more proactively than we used to. So since London Partners was set up in 2011 and then with the Olympics in 2012, London's global brand, London's global reputation was flying high. And quite frankly, an organisation like London and Partners didn't need to do much of the proactive storytelling and reputation building, because that story was really telling itself. So we were really focusing all of our resources on the more one-to-one, working directly with investors, or the much more targeted tourism or study campaigns. We do now know that London's global reputation is at risk to some extent, and you can see that through a lot of the different sentiment studies that show that there's been a decline in sentiment towards London from international audiences. And that's new, that hadn't happened in the previous period. And so there is a need to respond to that. That's why we're doing more of this reputation and brand building work, which there wasn't a need to do in the past. So whilst generally, absolutely, it's core business, we are doing it in a much more proactive way and putting real effort into it in a way that we weren't previously.
Okay, so the 1.4 million, going back to the question, what have you spent that on? Extra staff, extra advertising? What have you actually done?
So it covers the salaries of those staff in markets, the costs of the co-working space where they are based, the recruitment of those staff. And
how many staff have you got involved in that?
So the additional staff in those extra 6 offices, there's another 16 staff there. So they're pretty small, 2 or 3 people in each location. Marketing costs and travel costs for those individuals, and then activity. So some marketing activity in terms of positive messaging around London.
Okay, right. The decision of the Economy Committee to summons documents from you last year was not taken lightly, but but because we just weren't getting anything from you at all. Today, a few of us here are not happy with the transparency. So what more do you think you should be doing? I mean, you didn't seem to have proper answers for Assemblymember Arnold's very, very good points on, you know, if you look at the Mayor, he says he wants to be transparent.
Transparent administration.
Yes, indeed, transparency all over the place we're told about. This LMP could not be less transparent unless they're dragged screaming towards it. What's your comment to that?
As I said before, we've heard your very legitimate concerns and your requests for us to be more transparent, and it's in the light of that that Andrew and I have taken the step of reviewing all of our transparency policies, having a public consultation about it, taking a set of recommendations to our board, and that has resulted in the most significant change to our transparency arrangements since we were set up. I think one of the most significant elements is this independent audit of our results, which means that you will be able, I hope, to have confidence that the outcomes that we're claiming for London are valid and have been checked by an independent third party who will be able to go through all of that evidence. Now, we've heard from you today other areas where you would like to see us go further, and as I've said, I'm very happy for us to take those back to the board, but I feel that what we have done in the changes that we made here is hear your concerns, take those away and make a very significant set of changes, which I should add are not without cost to us. We're having to employ additional staff to do this as well.
Okay, I've received representations from a partner of yours, Small Car Big City, who are under a very considerable pressure because they will suffer significant losses due to some of the Mayor's current proposals in relation to the private hire industry. Have you spoken to the Deputy Mayor for Business regarding this? How do you intend to help them?
I'd like to check the facts of our conversations with them and write to you, if I may.
They're quite happy. They know I'm going to bring this up. They've written to you. What have you done about it?
I'd like to go and check what action has been taken and write to you.
I'm disappointed that you can't actually answer that, but anyway, I look forward to a speedy response to that. Can I ask both of you, if you were running a normal company, as in not a non-profit company, would either of you buy shares in this?
If in London Partners, if it was a commercial organisation, is that
Yes.
the question?
Yes.
I generally think we provide an excellent service and excellent value for money to.
That's not the answer to the question.
the
If this was
taxpayer.
a proper company, would you buy shares in it?
It's not a purely commercial entity, so I'm afraid I don't think there's a sensible answer to that question.
But
If it were,
it's designed to be going that way. That's what it was set up for. I'm just saying, would you have the confidence to buy shares in it?
it doesn't deliver a return to the owners of the company. It delivers a return to the London taxpayers and to Londoners.
I think that's the issue. We're concerned about the return to the taxpayers. I'll leave it at that, Chair.
Okay, I saw Assemblymember Pigeon.
Yes, I want to just pick up a couple of things. One, in December, there was a decision signed off here at City Hall that approved £20,000 towards a project which costs £40,000 to fund London and Partners to review potential major sports events hosting opportunities over the next 20 years. Isn't that just your bread and butter work? Why would you need specific funding to do that?
I'm not aware of that additional funding.
Are you aware of it, Laura?
I'm not aware of it. I'd like us to go away and have a look into it and write to you.
It was a decision signed off here, because it just struck me that that's your core business. It's about getting visitors into London, it's tourism, and actually surely you'd be horizon scanning, looking at what opportunities there were, talking to LLDC, who are probably already doing that, looking at the stadium, how they use Lee Valley Regional Park, Wembley. They're probably already doing that. I couldn't understand why you would need additional funding to do something which I'd have thought was your everyday work.
Let's look into it and come back to you if that's okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
And then, obviously, tourism is crucial, and Brexit, we may have very different views on this committee on that, but, you know, it is having an impact. I'm just looking at the tourism figures, and in January, ONS statistics showed that we welcomed 750,000 fewer EU visitors to London, and really a big slump, but also a slump in terms of their spending in London. What are you specifically doing to reverse these trends?
So we're not addressing the decline in EU tourist numbers, which, as you said, is actually quite significant at the moment. And if you look at the future projections, that is also of a decline. Our tourism strategy is more long term, and it's about winning the new audiences for London from the markets that are going to grow fast and bring the tourists that have the best behaviours for London, that drive inclusive growth in London. So we know from the research that those are the tourists, first-time young visitors, particularly from the US and from China, and to some extent from India. So we're really focused on the long-term sustainability of the London tourism industry and having a tourism industry in London that's beneficial for Londoners. So that's why all of our work is really focused on the US, China and India, and those very specific target markets.
Okay, but then you've opened up new teams, offices in Paris, Berlin, I think you mentioned earlier. Is that not part of their work as well, to potentially be selling the benefits of London for tourism and trying to help with that clear decline?
So they're mostly focused on trade and investment, and to some extent they also work on business tourism, so winning major events for London, where Europe is a very important source market. We've thought a lot about this and discussed it with Visit Britain. Visit Britain is putting very significant investment into particularly Germany, which is the market that's seeing the biggest decline, but other European markets as well, to address this issue of the fall. Our view is that we need to focus our interventions where we can have the biggest benefit and in the ways that are best for Londoners, and that what's driving the decline in EU tourist numbers are large macro issues that, with the budgets and resources we have, we cannot address. And so we're working very closely with Visit Britain on what they're doing, but we think we're better off looking for the long-term growth opportunity markets than trying to address this decline, which is very much sentiment driven.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, we've reached the end of that session. Members, can we note the contents of the discussion? Can we thank both of our guests for coming in, for the answers that they've given today? There's a couple of items of business to run through. It will take seconds, so if you don't mind staying put. Item 7 is the Budget and Performance Committee Work Programme. Can we note the provisional schedule of meetings for 1920 set out? Item 8 is the date of the next meeting, which is provisionally scheduled for the 21st of May at 10 o'clock in this room. Can we note that? Item 9, any other business that I consider urgent. We were circulated quite late the Mayor's capital spending plan for 1920. I've included it in the papers today. Can we note the spending plan as set out in the supplementary agenda?
Noted.
Okay, and with that, the meeting is closed. Thank you.
There's quite a lot to follow up.
Yes, we've noted it.
You've got it down. There's quite a lot of extra info.
GLA, Committee Room 5,